All right. First off, if you're watching this video, you're wanting to know whether or not I think you should play Murktide, traditional Murktide, or Oculus in your next tournament. And we're going to get to that eventually. But I just want to start off by saying I started off this video with like this script in mind. I typed it out. I started like recording in segments and was doing really good. And I got through like the majority of what I wanted to go through. I was going to go back and like edit out dead parts of the each individual clip. And I realized that the entire thing was like 7 minutes long. It's like, that's just not going to do. So I'm kind of going back through and free forming this a little bit. I like it more that way. It's a lot more natural, a lot more organic. A lot less of just like staring at a camera going and like throwing visuals up on the screen, which I might throw a visual up anyway, but we'll see. We'll see how I feel once I'm done actually recording this. But what I wanted to do with this video is we constantly get questions like, what do you think of Murktide? What do you think of Oculus? What should I play? Which of these is better? And I kind of want to give a breakdown of both of the decks, like not only what they're trying to accomplish, differences in the main board, differences in the sideboard, differences in game plan, mulligan decisions, stuff like that. So maybe if you're on the fence and you watch this, it'll help you choose one way or the other. As always, links down below. I probably won't I'll put some sort of Murktide and some sort of Oculus deck list up in the links. But for the most part for the video, I just like picked one of the random lists off Goldfish. So if you look at these lists and you say like, oh, well, traditional Murktide doesn't run this, or Oculus doesn't run that. These are all 5.0 lists off Goldfish. So somebody did, and they did well with them. And that's what we're rolling with. Okay. So let's get into like what the video is actually about. First off, if you're unsure about the generic idea of both of these decks, we'll give a quick rundown. Murktide, the traditional Murktide shell. And when I say traditional Murktide, this is kind of what I'm referring to. Like no Oculus, no Unearth, heavy on Psychic Frog, counter magic Murktide. And the idea being you're the control deck. Your job is to stall out the game and make sure your opponent can't do anything while you're setting up resources, you're drawing cards, you're hopefully getting a Psychic Frog down living, maybe just pinging with the Bowmaster, whatever. But you're trying to stall out the game until you can get like a big Murktide down and play a Protect the Queen game. That's where you get your big threat on board, you use your counter magic to keep your opponent from removing your big threat, and you kill them in a couple turns. It's really in tune with what Grixis Death Shadow used to be like, where you try to get down a Shadow or Gurmag Angler and eventually just hit them 3 or 4 times with that and win the game. But now instead of Shadow or Gurmag Angler, we have Psychic Frog and Murktide Regent. The bulk of the deck, like I said, is counter magic with counter spells, spell snare, spell pierce. One of the identifying factors of this build over Oculus is you're maxing out on some of these numbers. I say maxing out as in 4 of, I mean maxing out in terms of you're playing as many copies as you can fit in the deck. So in this case, like the 3 spell snare, 3 spell pierce, 3 force of negation, 2 shoot the sheriff plus a wrath effect, 4 fatal push. You're just playing a lot of this interaction. So for the Murktide strategy to be successful, you can't throw away cards early. You can't use your counter magic on threats that aren't deserving of that spell. I guess that's the best way to put it. You're really wanting to save it for like the haymakers, the things that are going to deal with your Murktide, the things that are going to actually win the game for your opponent. And what I see a lot of is people getting into matches where they just start like saying, oh, I've got a counter spell. My opponent puts like on the stack, I'm going to counter spell it. And that's a lot of times how it ends up biting them in the butt, because they get later down in the match and realize, oh, I don't have that counter spell anymore. My opponent gets to resolve the One Ring or whatever their big haymaker card is and kind of outvalue me from there. The other way that this deck falls behind is early aggression. So if your opponent's playing like an aggro creature deck, you've only got 4 copies of Fatal Push, and then maybe like Bowmaster, Shoot the Sheriff if you're still on Bowmaster. So a couple early threats from your opponent can kind of run away with things because you can't counter something that's already on the board, and you're limited on the amount of interaction you have for creatures that have already resolved. To kind of make up for this, you see the sheer number of like 1-mana interaction we have plus Force Negation. This lets you do a better job of fetching up your Surveil lands early to help filter, smooth out some of those early draws, and potentially get to a big Murktide while trying to keep up as much interaction as you can as often as possible through the early game. Sideboard for Murktide. There's like a lot of overlap between the two decks. Actually, we'll get to the sideboard after I go through the Oculus deck. So that's kind of the general breakdown of what traditional Murktide is trying to accomplish. For Oculus, it's a little bit different. Murktide kind of takes that approach of, I don't want to throw out a threat early and make them have the answer, because if they've got it, I might not see another threat for a while. Oculus really does a good job of flipping that on its head and saying, hey, I am going to jam threats early, and I'm going to kind of force you to have the interaction. If you do, I'm either going to have Force Negation to protect my threat, or I'm going to have Unearth to get it back after you've killed it, depending on the kind of matchup we're in, the kind of hand I got. And so I'm really going to put the question back into your side and say like, okay, I've got my thing. How do you answer it? And Oculus does a really good job of that by not only being a really good snowball effect if you can unearth it early, but not being the most difficult thing to hard cast for 3 mana with all of the cantrips that you have access to, Psychic Frog to help discard some dead stuff, your fetches and Surveil lands to help fill out the graveyard. And you get this added avenue of the cantrip difference. So in your traditional Murktide decks, you're sitting on 4 Preordain to try to filter your draws, make your deck as consistent as possible. With this build, with a lot of the Oculus builds, you're looking at Thought Scour and Consider more often than not. And it's because you really value getting stuff into your graveyard, not only to power out Oculus, but also for the off chance that you flip over an early Oculus, Psychic Frog, Harbinger of the Seas, Phyrexian Crusader, whatever, and just get to unearth it for cheap plus hold up some amount of interaction. In order to fit this unearth package, usually the deck cuts down on things like Spell Snare, Spell Pierce, Cling to Dust, Go for the Throat, or Sink into Stupor, Shoot the Sheriff, something like that. Just trimming on some amount of interaction to fit this like, oops, I win, get out of jail free kind of package for the early game, which definitely has its benefits. The downside, though, is when you max out on a bunch of cantrips in your deck, you run the risk of your cantrips just finding more cantrips instead of actually finding stuff you need to find or live spells. You also run into a lot of trap hands where you say, oh, I've got an Oculus, I've got Counter Spell and Fatal Push and a couple like a Dark Slick Shores and a Watery Grave, and I'll just play like a good mid-range game until I get this Oculus down, and you just don't, because that Oculus runs the risk of not having 6 cards in the yard. So you need Thought Scours, you need Considers, you need fetches, or you just draw Unearths and you can't do anything with them because you don't have a frog, you can't discard the Oculus, you don't have a way to get it into your graveyard, things like that. So you do have to understand that with these Oculus builds, like, you are not the control deck more often than not. You're the beatdown deck with a little bit of permission in there to kind of keep your opponent off your back while you get the job done, get the game over with. Now we'll get into sideboarding. So the bulk of the sideboard, a lot of the heavy hitters really overlap between the two decks. For instance, you've got 3 to 4 copies of Consigned to Memory in both decks, some number of Toxic or Glistening Deluge. You've got Stern Scolding for the small creatures decks. A lot of time, like Mystical Dispute overlaps, and some amount of Graveyard Hate, either in the form of Nihil Spellbomb or Unlicensed Hearse, or the newly printed Ghost Vacuum has become a popular pickup lately. Now, where the Murktide deck, actually, since we're on Oculus, we'll just start with Oculus. Where the Oculus deck really is able to pivot well sideboarding is with the creature package. So, for example, like Harbinger of the Seas, Phyrexian Crusader, having access to this Unearth already lets you kind of overutilize getting those cards back, or potentially flip them over early with a Thought Scour and get a big tempo swing. Or Oculus, when it comes down, starts refilling your graveyard, and you're able to dig for those Phyrexian Crusaders, Harbingers a little bit more consistently. On the flip side, the Dimir Murktide deck usually is upping the number of cards like Stern Scolding or Mystical Dispute to help fight creature decks, fight the mirror, maybe upping on Toxic Deluge. And then because you are a slower clock, you're a much more reactive deck. Cards like Break the Ice do a better job against Eldrazi, just because you're not putting the kind of pressure that the other shells are. So that's a lot of where the sideboard differences are coming in. So we've got a general breakdown of the two decks, where they differ as far as deck construction. I really want to get into like play patterns and mulligan decisions and things like that. And I think that's where, like, as we say, the meat and potatoes of the video is going to be. This is the stuff that like is going to help you decide, oh, which of these two versions do I want to go with? I'll start with Murktide, like traditional Murktide. And the reason is it's the deck that I'm definitely more familiar with. I've had more success with, so I feel a little bit more confident, like, giving my 2 cents on this build. Sideboarding, or I don't want to start this. We'll just start like general play pattern and mulligan decisions. Mulligans with Murktide are going to look more like your traditional control decks, where you're going to have an opener of, oh, I got 3 lands, Spell Pierce, Preordain, Force Negation, Bowmaster. And you have to make a decision off that. You're never going to be as proactive consistently as Oculus is, but you are going to have hands that start off with like Psychic Frog, Force Blue card. And that is the plan for the hand, is hope Psychic Frog lives, Force Negation, a removal spell, and try to snowball that card advantage that way. Where you're going to have some random hands against like Eldrazi, where you've got 3 fetches, Preordain, Cling to Dust, and a Murktide, and just say, all right, I'm going to get down to turn 3 Murktide and hope that's good enough. But I really do think that traditional Murktide favors the patient, passive player. You really have to look at an opening hand and say, okay, this hand doesn't win right away. I don't have a clear path to victory, but I have a way to set victory up. Like, I've got Preordained to help dig. I've got a Psychic Frog to kind of stave off some early aggression, maybe get some cards, whatever, until I find a Murktide Regent. I've got 3 fetches, including a black fetch and a Harbinger of the Seas. This can stall out for a really good time until I'm able to find some more impactful spells, stuff like that. And you really have to lean into the idea of like, I'm not going to be able to beat everything early. I just need to be able to beat it late. I don't need to be able to deal with like the turn 1 Ocelot Pride all the time, but I do have to deal with the turn 4 One Ring. If I don't deal with the One Ring, like, they're going to run me over. If I don't deal with the Leyline bindings on my Murktide, they're going to take me out, whatever the case may be. But you just have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis everything your opponent plays and make like an in-game decision of, is this worth interacting with? Do I need to let it go and just move on to the next thing? what gives me the best chance of closing out the game once I do find that Murktide and I've survived the early game. I feel that gives a pretty good breakdown. I did go through and like poll people in the Control Freak Discord, which I'll have the link down below for that as well, as to why they were kind of gravitating towards the traditional shell versus Oculus. For traditional Murktide, the consensus typically ended up being like, I want the extra interaction. I feel like Oculus is either A, having too many dead cards and I want more like live stuff, or I like playing the control route. I like telling my opponent that they can't do whatever it is they want to do, and eventually I'll figure out winning the game. But at least for the early turns, I just want to say no to a bunch of stuff if I can. Both strategies, I think, completely viable, but Murktide for me has been the more successful of the two recently. So let's hop on over to Oculus. And I think the gameplay between Oculus and Murktide, even though the decks look remarkably similar, I do think it's kind of night and day. For the Oculus builds, a lot of mulliganing comes down to, is this hand proactive? Does it do something really good really early? You're going to have a lot of hands with Oculus that are like Thought Scour, Unearth, couple lands, Bowmaster, Force, Oculus, something like that. Like, do I have to take this hand, hope to flip over something to Unearth? If I don't flip over something, what am I looking to draw? If I find a third land and just hard cast Oculus with Force, is that good enough? It's a lot of, do I see a clear game plan? And is that game plan proactive? I do think a lot of the losses from Oculus come to trying to be Murktide when you're not Murktide. Trying to keep hands that are like Spell Snare, Counter Spell, Force, Bowmaster, Oculus, couple lands, and just like hoping it gets there. And you just end up stalling out. Maybe your opponent plays a cheap creature, and instead of committing into your counter spells every turn, they just hit you for 2 over and over again. And now you're stuck with like a bunch of dead cards in hand because your hand wasn't proactive initially. I do think Psychic Frog is the best card in the deck for both decks more often than not, but especially so for Oculus. But you've got a lot of games that you have to make an on-the-fly decision of like, your opponent goes to kill your Psychic Frog. Do I discard this Oculus when I don't have Unearth? Do I discard the rest of my hand to try to set up Oculus next turn? What's my game plan? And usually with these Oculus builds, I kind of lean towards whatever the more aggressive route is. Obviously, that's not a perfect formula. But if I have the chance to, say, discard 2 or 3 cards to Psychic Frog and play out an Oculus the next turn, let's say I don't have an Unearth, then a lot of times I'll kind of lean towards that route. Might not be right more often than not, but you just don't have the sheer volume of interaction to compete into the mid to late game like Murktide does. So you have to lean into getting a Frog online, getting the Oculus online, be more aggressive with ditching to Frog, be more aggressive with fetching as often as possible to get Oculus online, force whatever you can, Spell Snare, push whatever you can to get cards in the yard for Oculus. Now, the really cool thing about the two builds is there is a tremendous amount of crossover that's possible. We're seeing more and more people trophy with Oculus builds with like 2 or 3 Murktide. We're seeing people on traditional Murktide builds with 2 or 3 Oculus. And I think that's really cool because it means you don't have to be pigeonholed into one version or the other. You have a lot of room to try out different configurations and find one that works. So let's get down to what I recommend. And this is always a really tricky question because most Most of the time, the answer is I recommend whatever you play better or whatever you actively want to play or whatever you're more comfortable with. And then it comes to this deck. And I actually have some pretty strong feelings towards a few cards here and there that I want to go over. And I really have to stress out because God knows it doesn't really matter what I say on the video as far as disclaimers go, or these are my thoughts and my thoughts alone. And if you don't want to listen to them, don't listen to them. There's going to be people that just like ignore this statement and go to, I played XYZ at F&M and it did really well, so you're wrong. Okay, great. Disregard this whole section. Stop watching the video now because the rest of it is all going to be my opinions. And if you don't want to hear them, that's fine. If you don't want to be swayed by them, that's fine. These are my opinions, mine. You don't have to share them. They're mine. You came to watch the video. You came to hear the rant, so this is what you get. Let's start off with good cards from the Murktide side. I think that Harbinger of the Seas is like criminally undervalued. I would almost consider going up to 3, maybe even 4 in the 75, but 3 in the main. I think this card gets more free wins than any other card in the deck, and I don't even think it's particularly close. There are so many games that your opponent, especially game ones, that your opponent doesn't respect Harbinger. You drop it down and the game is just over on the spot. And that is a huge deal for a reactive control style shell. I do think Harbinger is better in the Oculus builds than it is in traditional Murktide, but I think either way you're going, I think Harbinger is way, way, way undervalued. Same with Force of Negation. I keep seeing people cutting down to like 2 copies of Force or 1 copy in the main, 1 copy in the side. I think this is like the glue card that holds the archetype, not just one deck or the other, but holds the entire archetype together. Because being able to play out your frog and protect it is fantastic for both decks. And Force Negation is like the card that lets you do that. There are going to be some feels bad moments where your opponent goes for a static prison on your frog and you Force Negation it and they play another static prison and there's nothing you can do about it. It's going to happen. It's going to suck. I don't know what to tell you on that end, but the card itself is just so extremely good at letting you be proactive with whichever build you go with. I would highly recommend having at least 3 in the 75, but it's another one that if you went up to a 4th copy in the sideboard or a 3rd copy in the sideboard, maybe 4th, I wouldn't blame you at all. Toxic Deluge versus Glistening Deluge. Toxic Deluge gets the nod for me 99.73% of the time, approximately. The 2 big reasons are, 1, if your opponent starts off Guide of Souls into any of the 2 drops and get enough energy to give the Guide of Souls flying, then Glistening Deluge doesn't kill it. And that's a big deal because Guide of Souls with flying, really good way for them to get over Bowmasters. The extra counters makes it so that they can survive a Glistening Deluge and give something else flying in additional counters so that it could survive a Glistening Deluge. And that's just not an avenue I want to go down. I want my Wrath to clear up the board, period. I also want my Wrath to be castable under Blood Moon. There's going to be a bunch of like Boros players that don't keep in Blood Moon post board because, hey, you're a Harbinger deck, they're a Blood Moon deck, everybody's getting basics, it doesn't matter. but there are going to be just as many that keep Blood Moon in or board extras in against you because they want to shut you off mana. So having a wrath effect that you can't cast under Blood Moon, I think, is a very, very significant deal. That's also part of the reason that I don't like Phyrexian Crusader. It's another threat that you can't cast through Blood Moon. It is a little bit better because of the Thought Scour Unearth Frog package, but I still think it's a card that Boros a lot of times can ignore and just kind of swing around. But back to this build. Counter spell's great. Bowmaster is very medium. I don't think its impact on the game. Bowmaster is like the epitome of a jack of all trades card. I don't think its impact on the game is felt very strongly in the sense that, oh, this card came down and like overwhelmed my opponent. There's nothing they can do about it. I don't think it's anything like that. But I also don't think the card has any sort of similar one-for-one replacement. Like, probably the most popular question I see is, I don't want to buy Bowmasters. What do I replace it with? And the fact is, there is no one-for-one replacement for Bowmasters because Bowmasters just does a job that's so much different than every other card that you could have access to in that slot. It's a little bit of wiggle room against aggressive creature decks with chump blockers. It's a little bit of extra pressure against control decks with a flash threat that maybe they draw a card and you get to ping them. It's got random combo matches that it's really useful into. Like if your opponent gets a Gristlebrand down, if playing Gristlebrand, if they're playing what's that card? Say its name or whatever, and get the big demon. Bowmaster just blows that out of the water. It's reasonable into One Ring decks, but the One Ring decks are going to have answers for it because they expect the card to be there. It's pretty okay into like aggressive creature decks. Helps answer opposing Bowmasters. It just does so many things at like a C+ rate level that it becomes a card where the sum of its individual value parts is kind of greater. What's the analogy there? Sum is greater than its parts. Like getting all those individual things together makes it a better card than if you just try to piece out each little aspect of it. But at the end of the day, if you decided to cut Bowmasters, I wouldn't blame you. I'd probably just go to like some Archmage's Charms or something like that. Try to find your threats more consistently. Don't let the big thing that you would be Bowmastering down resolve. Shoot the Sheriff first. Go for the Throat. Go for the Throat misses construct tokens that I think are very, very annoying. It also misses Scion of Draco. It's a pretty big deal. Shoot the Sheriff misses Ragavan and Dauthi. I have seen a big uptick in Ragavan recently, so don't blame me for go for the Throat there. The Cantrip package, Preordain versus Consider Thoughtscour. I think Thoughtscour and Consider are absolutely awful Magic cards and are only in consideration because of Unearth and the need to fill the graveyard pretty aggressively. And I don't think that's really too hot of an opinion there. I'd probably argue that a good bit of the people playing Thoughtscour don't want to play Thoughtscour, but are kind of making themselves play Thoughtscour. Spell Pierce is better than I think people give it credit for. It's really good for countering rings on rate. Less good against like the ring out of Eldrazi, but basically none of your stuff is good against Eldrazi anyway, so that's kind of the way it is. But being able to counter things on turn 2, like turn 2 on the draw, I should specify. Being able to counter things turn 2 on the draw, like Malevolent Rumble or Talismans, Goblin Bombardment, things like that. Really, really nice. It does get sideboarded out a good bit for me because a lot of games you just know they're going long. And so Spell Pierce on like turn 3, 4, 5, a lot of times just isn't doing it for me. Cling to Dust, I think, is very, very underrated. I think being a cantrip for 1 in black is nice. Being able to escape it late is really cool. I don't care about the synergy with Murktide. I don't suggest playing Cling to Dust just so you can escape it late and like grow a Murktide or target something of your own to grow Murktide, but it does come up a reasonable amount of the time. But just having a main deck like targetable Grave Hate piece against opposing Unearth decks or Goryo's Vengeance, or so many decks right now care about Delirium or care about Flage. I just think Cling to Dust is like a really versatile answer into a lot of those kind of cards. So I'm a big proponent of having some number in the 75. I think I'm currently on 2 in the main, but if you wanted to just run 1 in the main, by all means, just run 1. Sideboard. I don't really want to get into the sideboard too much. Let's just go over to the Oculus list and talk about some of the cards here, what I think about them. Unearth, Thought Scour, Consider, I think are absolutely awful. There are so many times that you have an Unearth in hand that's dead because you just don't have any creatures in the graveyard, and there's not really a lot you can do about that. Thought Scour and Consider are just suboptimal cantrips. Thought Scour literally just in here for the extra cards in the graveyard for Oculus, as well as the chance of maybe flipping something over that you get to unearth. Consider instant speed, maybe you surveil over something. But if that's something that you're relying on happening consistently, you're going to have a lot of issues with like not having that happen. And then your cantrip is just worse than preordained, because you can always say, oh, I'll look at the top card, I don't like it, put it on the bottom, or put it in the graveyard, see the second card. Now my Consider is basically preordained. It's not. Having the knowledge of the 2 cards before you make a decision is so much different than having the knowledge of that first card, having to make a decision on it without knowing anything about the second one. As well as preordained, if you don't like either of those cards, seeing a third card down for 1 mana, as opposed to Consider seeing the first 2 at most, definitely plays a big part. So in terms of consistency, the edge I definitely think goes to the traditional Murktide shell. Explosiveness, Oculus runs away with the explosiveness comparison. Like, you're going to have hands where you just go turn 1, fetch up an Undercity Sewers, flip over an Oculus, turn 2, unearth it with like a Spell Snare backup, and there is literally nothing your opponent can do about it. And those games, you're going to feel like the greatest gamer that's ever touched Magic Online or your LGS or whatever the case may be. It's just not consistent. And it's okay for it to not be consistent, because it wouldn't be like an unbeatable start, or it wouldn't be a legal modern deck if it were consistently unearthing an Oculus on turn 2 or whatever. But with these extra copies of Unearth, the Oculus itself, you put yourself in this position where Grave Hate is so much better against you than the traditional shells, because Grave Hate means my Unearths are just dead, my Oculus are just dead, my Psychic Frogs are pretty bad, and now they're worse than Grave Hate would be. Or if my opponent has Grave Hate against me with Oculus, then that's much worse for me than if my opponent had Grave Hate against me with Murktide, because now not only do I have to lean into like Psychic Frog more aggressively, but my Psychic Frog is drawing me into more dead copies of Oculus and Unearth and things like that, instead of finding me more actual interaction to maybe help that Psychic Frog cross the finish line. I do think that if this Oculus deck gets a good pivot against Grave Hate, I don't know what it would be, but something to do against Leyline of the Void, whatnot, then that could help it out a good bit. But I just don't think it's found that identity yet. Still think it's kind of messing around with trying to be a bad Murktide deck instead of focusing all its efforts on being a good Oculus deck. Mentioned a lot of the crossover, like a lot of Oculus builds going to 2 or 3 copies of Murktide, which is cool. At the same time, you are just like getting worse and worse and worse against your biggest weakness, that is graveyard hate. So be careful of that if you decide to sleeve up Oculus. Overall, my opinion of the 2 decks and my recommendation is I'm still heavy in the camp of traditional Murktide. The reason being, the main reasons being, one, my RNG stat is not nearly high enough to high roll off Thought Scours. I know what my luck is like, and it doesn't pan out for me. And this is not a speculation. I have played a reasonable amount of Oculus. I'm not going to say like some overloaded, blown out of proportion amount, but a decent amount of Oculus. And I just have not had any sort of consistency to like Thought Scouring over a threat to Unearth. Maybe once in a blue moon it's happened, or Frog aggressively ditch, get back or Unearth back in Oculus and not immediately get punished by like a static prison or something. So for me, I just prefer the consistency. I prefer Murktide having a much better idea of what you're going to get from all of your individual cards, not really having things, or not having more cards than you absolutely have to that are dead in any particular matchup or against any particular scenario. The extra consistency in the sideboard of like an additional copy of Stern Scolding, Mystical Dispute, Consign to Memory, Break the Ice against the Eldrazi decks. I think those pieces really add up over the course of a big tournament. So yeah, pretty heavy in the traditional Murktide camp. That being said, when Oculus really starts to form its identity, and I think there are some cards that are doing a good job of getting to that point. Like I've seen more Oculus builds running Thoughtseize recently. I think that's a really good card for this archetype, because not only are you able to add a little more interaction that the deck didn't have before, but you also open up lines of like turn 2, Thoughtseize myself, discard an Oculus, unearth it. Now I have an additional avenue to get Oculus in my graveyard against some of the unfair matchups where that card disadvantage isn't that big of a deal because I just have an Oculus out. Or unearth or Thoughtseize my own Harbinger and unearth it, and just lock my opponent out of the game. Lines like that make these decks a lot more consistent with the explosiveness, and I think that that's a really good idea to have access to. I just don't think that those ideas are popular enough recently to where people really like nailed down a deck list that is able to utilize a lot of those different tools. But doesn't mean it won't happen, just mean I don't think it's happened yet. Any other hot opinions that I have on the decks? Like I said, there's going to be people in the comments left and right that are just like, oh no, I totally went 3-1 at my FNM with Oculus and I outgrinded everybody, and Murktide couldn't do that for me. And that's great, but I'm going to give you a piece of hot take advice here. FNM results really don't mean anything. 5-0s in leagues really don't mean anything. I would just focus on things like X2 conversion rates for challenges, for RCs, things like that. RCQ results really don't mean anything. The majority of RCQs out there are probably like 15 to 30 players. It's just not enough to really pull any meaningful data from. It's probably the strength level of like, I don't know, 3/4 of a modern online league. And that's coming from my own experience at RCQs as well. Just the level is not there. So don't take somebody saying like I 3-1 at FNM, my FNM's very competitive, as being the end all be all. of your decision making as to what deck you're going to play and who to listen to. Ultimately, it comes down to make your own decisions. I know nobody wants to hear that, but that's the only way that you're going to pick up a deck that you're comfortable running, is to give them both a shot, see which one you mesh with more. The TLDR, the Oculus build is going to be the more proactive, aggressive build if you feel like you're comfortable digging for those hands or setting up those plays. The Murktide build is going to be the more controlling build, the more passive one. So if you feel more comfortable with not having a clear goal in mind and kind of taking every turn in stride and adjusting accordingly, then I think Murktide's going to service, or traditional Murktide's going to service you better. And if you want to mix things up, then mix things up. Like if you want to run 3 Murktide, 2 Oculus, and keep the Murktide shield, do it. If you want to run Oculus with a couple Murktide, do it. That's the great thing about this archetype. There is room to adjust. There are a lot of flex spots. You can shift stuff around however you want. Yeah, that's about all I got. Hopefully you enjoy the video. Hopefully it gave you something to think about. If you want to yell at me in the comments and say I'm wrong and I don't know what I'm talking about, then by all means, I welcome the interaction. Other than that, I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I hope you win your next tournament. Adios for now.